council meeting today, and you killed it. Good job. I can't believe you guys have been in troop together since first grade. That's so great. That's great. Congratulations, and thank you for being here today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Randy Meyer. Welcome back. We're going to break away from all day for just a second. We have some breaking news to tell you about. Minnesota Supreme Court has reached its decision on whether former President Donald Trump should be kept off the ballot here in Minnesota. Just moments ago, the court ruled to dismiss the lawsuit that aimed to remove the former president from the ballot in our state. By doing so, it allows Trump to stay on the ballot here. Now, just last week, justices heard arguments in a lawsuit filed here in Minnesota to keep Trump off state ballots in that 2024 election over his alleged role in the January 6th Capitol attack. Similar lawsuits were also filed in other states. In fact, one lawsuit is making its way through the courts right now in Colorado. The one filed here went straight to the Minnesota Supreme Court, and that's what brings us to today. During those arguments last week, justices were skeptical on whether states should decide if the former president appears on the ballot. Chief Justice Natalie Hudson suggesting that decision should come from Congress. The argument from the plaintiffs was this: Trump should be disqualified and kept off the state's March 5th primary because the 14th Amendment, or clause in the 14th Amendment, bars anyone from office who swore an oath to uphold the Constitution and then subsequently engaged in insurrection against it. There's also the matter of how to define insurrection. There's a lot to unpack here. Joining me now, political science professor David Schultz to help explain how we got here today. David, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. We talked last night during the election, so I'm glad to have you back here today. The central argument here is whether states should decide who is on the ballot. The court, as we found out, was hesitant to get involved in something that they said would be a congressional matter. Your take on how we got here?
Okay, first off, no surprise in terms of what the Minnesota Supreme Court said. Last week during oral arguments, Chief Justice Hudson really sort of tipped her hand when she said at one point to the people arguing for Trump to be taken off, even if we have the authority to do this, should we do it? And that really tipped it off. But how we got here is that there is a clause in the 14th Amendment called the Insurrection Clause that says that people who previously swore an oath to the Constitution and held office and engaged in insurrection could be prevented from holding future office. What was happening here is that people were filing a suit arguing that that clause applied to Donald Trump's activities on January 6, 2021, and that because of what he did that day, that rose to what's called an insurrection, and therefore he couldn't become president again, and for the purposes of this lawsuit, could not appear on the ballot in 2024 in Minnesota. What the Minnesota Supreme Court said essentially today is that we're not going to hear this case. We're not going to render an opinion on the merits of that argument, essentially saying this is perhaps what? A matter for Congress to take up, maybe a matter for the voters to decide whether he should be on the ballot, but the court issued no, what we call opinion on the merits, or no substantive opinion at all regarding whether he engaged in insurrection or did not.
David, there were a few questions involved here that the court had to take up. I'm going to read a couple of them as it relates to that clause in the 14th Amendment. These were the questions. Does the clause apply to presidents was one of the questions that they had to address. Can the clause be enforced without legislation from Congress? You mentioned that just now. And is the issue a political question outside the court's authority? And I think as we watch this thing unfold over the course of the last few months, that was one of the bigger questions from a political standpoint is, should the courts be involved in a situation where we've got the leading Republican candidate for president in a situation like this being kept off ballots? And is it then a huge, as it says here, political question that the courts did not and should not want to be involved in?
Right. Let me start with the political question first. About a quarter century ago, there was a famous U.S. Supreme Court case, Bush v. Gore, which involved resolving vote counts in the state of Florida. The Supreme Court issued an opinion there that eventually led to George Bush winning Florida in the Electoral College and winning the presidency. And many people were very, very critical of that opinion and said that the courts should not decide elections, that the people should decide elections. And I think in the back of the Minnesota Supreme Court's mind, and I think clearly Hudson's mind, was that as a precedent, that at the end of the day, who should appear on the ballot is what we call a political question. It's something for somebody else to decide. Could it be Congress? Yes. Should it be the American public? Perhaps yes. But it's not a task for the court to be able to address this type of an issue. In terms of these other questions, I think the court was concerned about. It was worried about, well, how do we define an insurrection? What does it mean by that? And if you read the insurrection clause, it never at any point says that it applies to the president of the United States or an ex-president of the United States. All of these raised enough questions in the mind, I would say, from the oral arguments, the Minnesota Supreme Court, for it to say, these are the kind of questions we can't really resolve, and we need to kick this over to somebody else. Along with, I think, the concern that, again, Hudson articulated or said is that, what if we say he can't appear on the ballot? Other states say he can.
Right.
We start to get almost this patchwork or crazy quilt pattern of states deciding who gets to run for president of the United States at the national level. And at the end of the day, I think she was hesitant, and the Minnesota Supreme Court was hesitant of saying what Minnesota says shouldn't govern the rest of the country.
Yeah, and I think theoretically they said it's possible that if this went through, you could have 50 different ballots in 50 different states, to your point. I do want to ask you about whether you believe this ruling today, because we did mention there were other similar cases moving through courts in several other states. The one that comes to mind is Colorado right now, where a similar case is moving through their courts. Right. It hasn't reached, I don't believe it's reached the Supreme Court level there yet, but does this have any precedent-setting initiative as those other states look at similar cases?
From a technical legal point of view, and I speak as a law professor also, the answer is no. What the Minnesota Supreme Court says is not binding per se on the Colorado Supreme Court. But I suspect, as we oftentimes see, what one state Supreme Court says and its decisions might be persuasive, might provide guidance to other courts. And in some sense, given the fact that this is a sort of a first major sort of decision, I say sort of decision because it doesn't actually rule on the merits, but a decision about whether to hear the case, I suspect the Colorado Supreme Court, the Michigan Supreme Court, which is hearing matters like this, and other states may turn to it and say, okay, Minnesota has already thought through these issues and they've reached some conclusions. We're going to take into consideration what they have to say. So this is a very important opinion. I'm almost going to call it's an important non-decision, if that makes sense. The court decided not to decide, and that could have an impact on how other courts approach this issue across the United States.
I think it's clear for our viewers and listeners to understand what the court actually did. It basically doesn't allow the lawsuit to move forward, correct?
Correct.
It doesn't have a ruling on whether or not Trump should be allowed on the ballot. It just says this particular lawsuit brought by 8 Minnesota voters cannot move forward in the Minnesota courts. Is that accurate?
Yeah. That's accurate. The way we would describe it in law is that the court dismissed the case, issuing no opinion on the merits. And what it did here today was to say, we're dismissing, not making any ruling on the merits, and making no decision regarding any of the legal questions that were being addressed. So we have no answers to the question regarding, did he engage in an insurrection? Was what happened in January 6th an insurrection, et cetera, et cetera? The court is not deciding it. It's saying we're deciding not to decide.
All right, David, in summary here, before I let you go, just kind of give our viewers a sense of how you will sort of sum this up to your students at Hamline, because this obviously will be a subject, probably already has been a subject leading into today. So give us a quick summary of how you would describe this to students who are studying political science.
Okay. What I would say to my students at this point is that the Minnesota Supreme Court heard arguments on both sides regarding whether Trump should be kept on the ballot or kept off the ballot. And at the end of the day, what the court said is that we don't believe we are the proper place or the proper forum to resolve that question. Somebody else should resolve it, maybe Congress, maybe the U.S. Supreme Court, or maybe the voters. But this is not the time or the place, and we are not the institution to make that decision.
All right, David Schultz, Hamline University political science professor. Thanks for your insight. Always appreciated it.
My pleasure, Randy. Thank you.
All right, we'll see you soon. All right, that's it. The breaking news out of the Minnesota Supreme Court. We'll have much more of this throughout the evening as well on our regular newscasts over on Fox 9. In the meantime, I'll send you back to All Day. I'll see you later.
Last of the Trumps to testify and the last witness that the Attorney General's office plans to call for their case. The Trump's lawyers will start calling witnesses starting on Monday. Reporting live, I'm Morgan Mackay. Lexi, back to you.
All right, Morgan, thanks so much. Appreciate that update.
Thank you.
All right, and let's continue on, show you a live picture here that we're getting out of New York City. You can see these dueling protests that are happening as the war intensifies in the Middle East. So continuing to bring you all of these live pictures. We'll also